My name is Joanne Mercer, and the night my heart nearly stopped, I was sitting at the kitchen table staring at a pile of medical bills I couldn't pay. I remember how my hands kept shaking as I tried to read the total again, as if the numbers would somehow change if I squinted hard enough. But they didn't. $68,000 for a surgery I needed within the next 3 months, or the doctor said my chances were, basically, a coin toss. I felt this tight, twisting pain in my chest, and I pressed my palm there, hoping it would go away, hoping maybe it was just another anxiety attack and not the real thing. But deep down, I knew it was my heart, reminding me how little time I had left. I picked up the phone and called Marcus, my only son, the boy I'd raised by myself after his father walked out when he was 5. He answered on the third ring. Before I tell you my story, please make sure to like and subscribe to support the channel. Also, let me know how your day is going and where you're from. Thanks. He answered on the third ring, and I could hear the television in the background, some sports announcer shouting like it was the most important moment in the world. And I almost hung up, because I knew he wouldn't want to hear what I had to say. But I swallowed my pride and said his name. I told him I needed help, that this wasn't some frivolous thing, that I needed heart surgery or I would die. I could hear the way he took a slow breath, like he was already annoyed, and he said, "Mom, we've been over this. We have our own bills. We can't just pull money out of nowhere." I tried to explain that I'd already sold everything else I could think of. My old jewelry, my car, even the piano his grandmother left me. And this was the only thing I had left to ask for. He didn't say anything, and I could picture him sitting there on that tan sofa I'd helped him pick out when he and Sarah first moved in, watching the game like my life wasn't ending. I reminded him that I'd paid off the mortgage on the house he was living in, that I'd signed it over to both our names when he got married because he told me it would help with a loan application. I thought he'd remember that, maybe feel some gratitude, but all he said was, "I can't help you, Mom. I'm sorry." He didn't sound sorry. He sounded like he wanted to get back to his evening and forget I'd ever called. Before I could say another word, he hung up, and the silence in my kitchen felt heavier than anything. I sat there staring at the phone screen, my thumb hovering over redial because I didn't want to believe he meant it. I tried to remember if I'd done something to make him resent me this much, but nothing made sense. All those nights I'd worked extra shifts at the pharmacy to cover his college tuition. The way I never bought myself new clothes or went on vacations because he always came first. And now when I needed him to step up for me, he was too busy to care. My chest was still hurting, and I leaned forward, pressing my elbows on the table, breathing slow like the nurse told me. I thought about calling an ambulance, but I was afraid of the bill. That's the part that made me want to scream. Being scared to save your own life because you don't want to bankrupt yourself. I remember glancing at the clock. It was 8:47 p.m. when it hit me that no one was coming to help me. Not Marcus, not Sarah, no one. I thought about Eli and Zoe, my grandkids, who didn't even know their grandma was sitting alone trying not to die in her kitchen. I tried to think of someone else to call, maybe my sister Carol, but she was in Florida and hadn't spoken to me in 2 years over something so stupid. I couldn't even remember what started it. I thought about calling the pastor from my old church, but I didn't want to explain that my own son wouldn't help me. I didn't want anyone's pity. I wanted Marcus to care, to act like I mattered, and the pain eased a little. I stood up and walked to the cupboard, took out the last can of soup I'd been saving because I didn't know when I'd have enough for another grocery trip. I heated it on the stove, watching the label peel back from the steam. And I told myself that if I could just get through the night, I'd figure something out. I sat back down with the soup and opened the envelope from the hospital again. The payment plan they offered still meant I'd have to come up with almost $30,000 up front, and I didn't have it. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my spoon. I tried to eat, but every bite felt like sawdust. I couldn't stop thinking about Marcus's voice, how calm he sounded when he said no, like it was nothing. I picked up my phone again and scrolled through old photos. Marcus at his graduation, Sarah holding baby Eli, all of us smiling in front of that house I bought with every penny I ever saved. I thought about how proud I was the day I handed Marcus those keys, How he hugged me and said he'd never forget what I'd done for him. I guess he did forget. My chest started to tighten again, and I knew I couldn't sit there waiting for someone to rescue me. I finished the soup, rinsed the bowl, and set it on the rack. I looked around my kitchen at the outdated cabinets and the stack of coupon flyers I kept for when money got tight, and I decided I wasn't going to die in that chair waiting for Marcus to do the right thing. If he wouldn't help me, then I'd save myself. I walked to the cabinet where I kept the old file box, the one with every deed and bank statement I'd saved since the day I signed the papers on the house. I pulled it down and carried it to the table, ignoring the way my arms ached. I opened the lid and started sorting through everything. Old mortgage statements, the letter from the bank congratulating me when I paid the final balance, the deed with my name and my husband's, and Marcus's name added later when he said it would help him qualify for a better loan. My fingers stopped on the document that proved it was still mine. That no matter what he thought, he was living there because I let him. A strange calm settled over me then, like my heart knew I finally understood what I had to do. I placed the deed in a fresh envelope and set it beside the hospital bill. In that moment, I stopped being the mother who waited for her son to remember she mattered. I was a woman who was going to save her own life, no matter what it cost. The next morning, I woke up with my chest still feeling raw, like every part of me had been scraped hollow by what Marcus said. But I got out of bed, because sitting around hoping he would change his mind wasn't going to save me. I made myself some instant coffee and sat at the table with the deed and the hospital bill side by side, like they were two parts of the same ultimatum. I kept thinking how strange it was that the house I'd worked my whole life to pay off was the only thing left between me and dying, and the people living in it were the same ones who couldn't be bothered to help me. I sipped the coffee, even though it tasted like old pennies, and I called the hospital billing department to ask if there were any charity programs or any last resort options. The woman on the phone sounded tired when she said they'd already given me the maximum discount, that unless I could pay the deposit, my surgery date wouldn't be confirmed. I thanked her and hung up, feeling like my body was heavier than it had ever been. I thought about Marcus sitting in that house right now, probably eating breakfast with Sarah and the kids, not thinking twice about how his mother was planning how to keep herself alive without his help. My phone buzzed, and for a second my heart actually lifted because I thought maybe it was Marcus calling back to apologize, to say he'd thought it over and he'd help. But it was Sarah's number flashing across the screen. I almost didn't answer, but I told myself if she was reaching out, maybe she felt differently. I picked up and said hello, and she didn't even pause before she started talking. Her voice had this sharp edge to it, like I'd personally set out to ruin her day. She said she'd heard I'd called Marcus last night, and that I was making him feel guilty, that I needed to understand they had bills and obligations of their own, and that it wasn't fair of me to lay this on them. I sat there listening to her rattle off about their expenses. How Eli needed braces, how Zoe was supposed to start dance classes this fall, how Marcus had been stressed enough already, and every word felt like someone twisting a knife deeper in my ribs. I waited until she ran out of complaints, and I told her, in as calm a voice as I could manage, that this wasn't about guilt or obligation. This was about life and death, that her husband was my son, and if he could help even a little, he should. She let out this short laugh, like she couldn't believe I was still trying to plead my case, and she said, "Joanne, you have to stop acting like we owe you everything. You gave Marcus the house because you wanted to. You can't hold that over us forever." I didn't even know what to say to that, because I had never once thrown it in their faces, that I'd signed over the deed to help them qualify for a better mortgage, that I'd kept paying the property taxes for years, because Marcus kept saying he'd reimburse me when things got better. I reminded her that the only reason they even had that house was because I'd worked 3 jobs to make the down payment. And she said, "Well, maybe you should have thought about your own retirement instead of trying to be everyone's savior." That was when I realized there wasn't going to be any help, no matter how desperate I was. I hung up without another word, and I sat there at the table with my hands in my lap, feeling something in me go cold. For a few minutes, I thought about just giving up. I imagined what it would be like to let the disease take me, to close my eyes and never have to feel this kind of hurt again. But then I thought about Eli and Zoe, and how if I died without trying, they'd grow up thinking their grandmother had been weak. I couldn't let them believe that. I got up and pulled the file box back down from the cabinet, this time determined to find something I'd missed. I went through every folder, every letter, every receipt I'd kept for decades. Half of it was yellowed and brittle from age, but I was looking for any proof that could show the house was mine outright, not just the version Marcus and Sarah liked to pretend was true. After 2 hours, I found the original deed transfer document from when my husband died, the one that explicitly listed me as the primary owner and Marcus as the secondary, only for mortgage assistance, not as a gift. I read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't imagining it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep hold of the paper. But I knew then that if I needed to, I could sell the house without Marcus's permission. It felt like the last card I had left to play. I put it in a new envelope and slid it into my purse, and when I sat back down, the phone rang again. I thought it would be Sarah calling back to scold me some more, but it was the lawyer I'd worked with years ago to finalize the estate after my husband passed. I'd left a voicemail late last night and she was returning my call. Her voice was calm and steady, and for the first time in days, I felt like I wasn't completely alone. She asked me to come in that afternoon to talk through my options, and I agreed before I could overthink it. When I hung up, I looked around the kitchen and felt this strange clarity settle in. I was done begging. If my son wanted to pretend I didn't exist, then he could figure out how to pay for his own life without the house I'd built for him. I gathered up the hospital paperwork, the deed, and a folder of every receipt and tax bill I'd ever covered, and I put them all in a tote bag. I didn't bother changing out of my house dress or putting on makeup. I was too tired to care what anyone thought of me. On the bus ride to the lawyer's office, I kept thinking about all the little sacrifices that had led to this moment. The times I'd skipped meals so Marcus would have enough for field trips. The Christmases I'd gone without gifts, so he wouldn't feel the sting of not having what other kids had. And now here I was, riding public transit because I'd sold my car to pay for medication that still wasn't enough to save me without surgery. I felt this simmering anger in my chest. Not the sharp kind that makes you lash out, but the slow, steady burn that tells you you've finally reached the end of your patience. When I got to the office, the receptionist barely looked up as she handed me a clipboard of forms, and I sat down in the waiting area, filling them out, my handwriting trembling but legible. When they called me back, the lawyer, Miss Cameron, greeted me with the same polite smile she'd had 20 years earlier, but when she asked how she could help, I didn't sugarcoat anything. I told her I needed to know exactly what my rights were, how quickly I could sell the house, and what the consequences would be for Marcus and his family. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she took a deep breath and said, "Joanne, you are the legal owner of that property. You have the right to sell it if you choose. The only thing you'll have to navigate is the eviction timeline if they refuse to vacate voluntarily." Hearing those words made me feel like someone had lifted 1,000 pounds off my shoulders. For the first time, I knew I wasn't powerless. Miss Cameron warned me it wouldn't be easy, that Marcus and Sarah would likely fight me, maybe even try to make me look incompetent or unstable, but I told her I didn't care anymore. I'd spent my entire adult life putting Marcus first. Now it was my turn. As I signed the initial paperwork to start the process, I felt this strange combination of grief and relief. Grief that it had come to this, that the boy I'd loved more than anything could turn his back on me so easily. And relief that I finally had a plan. When I left the office, I didn't feel proud or triumphant. I felt tired, but I also felt something steadier. Like maybe, just maybe, I still had a chance to save myself, even if it meant losing the last illusions I'd held about my family. The day after I signed the first papers to start the sale, I woke up feeling like I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. And no matter how sure I'd been in that lawyer's office, part of me still hoped Marcus would call and say he understood why I had to do it. But there was no call, no text, no sign he even cared that I was about to take the only home his kids had ever known. I got dressed slowly, every movement reminding me that I wasn't the same woman I'd been 20 years ago, the one who could work a double shift and still come home to cook dinner without thinking twice. My chest felt heavy, not just from the disease, but from the certainty that no matter what happened, nothing between me and Marcus would ever be the same again. Around 10 that morning, Miss Cameron called to tell me she'd drafted the notice to vacate, and that legally, Marcus and Sarah would have 30 days to leave once the house was under contract. My stomach turned at the thought of sending them that letter. But I knew there wasn't any other way. The hospital had called twice already that week, reminding me that my surgery date was approaching and that they needed confirmation of payment. Every time I heard that voicemail, it felt like the walls were closing in, but at least now I had a way to make sure I'd still be here to see another Christmas. I told Miss Cameron to go ahead and send the letter by certified mail and email, and as soon as I hung up, I felt my hands start to sweat. I knew Marcus would see it as an attack, that he'd spin it into some story where I was the villain who'd ruined his life, but after everything he'd said, or refused to say, I was past the point of caring what he thought. Around lunchtime, the phone rang again, and when I saw his name on the screen, my heart lurched so hard I had to steady myself against the counter. I answered and tried to keep my voice calm, but the first thing out of his mouth was, "What the hell are you doing, Mom?" His tone was sharp, almost disgusted, and I could tell he hadn't called to ask how I was feeling or if I was scared about the surgery. He just wanted to know how I could possibly betray him like this. I told him I didn't have a choice, that I needed that money to stay alive, that I'd asked him for help and he'd made it clear he wasn't going to give it. But he didn't hear any of it. He said I was being vindictive, that I was trying to punish him because he couldn't wave a magic wand and make the money appear. I reminded him that it wasn't magic. It was the fact that he and Sarah had been living there rent-free for almost a decade while I covered the property taxes and repairs. He tried to argue that they'd put money into fixing it up, that they'd painted and replaced the carpet and bought new appliances. But I told him none of that changed the fact that the mortgage had been mine and that the only reason they'd had a safe place to raise their kids was because I'd made sure they did. He went quiet then, and for a second I thought maybe something had finally broken through that wall he'd built. But then he said, "If you go through with this, I swear to God you'll never see my kids again." My throat closed up so fast I couldn't answer right away. Eli and Zoe were the only family I had left who didn't look at me like I was a burden, and the idea of losing them almost made me cave. But then, I pictured that hospital bill and the way my heart felt like it was slowly choking me, and I realized it wasn't a choice between my life and my pride. It was a choice between my life and everything else. I told Marcus in a voice I barely recognized that if he wanted to use the kids to punish me, that was his burden to carry, not mine. And I hung up before I could hear another word. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone, and I had to sit down on the kitchen chair to catch my breath. For a long time, I just sat there staring at the countertop, feeling like every part of me had turned to stone. Eventually, I got up and started gathering the documents I'd need for the realtor appointment Miss Cameron had arranged. I put the deed, the tax receipts, and a copy of the hospital estimate into a folder, and I took a slow sip of water to calm my stomach. On the bus ride to the realtor's office, I kept thinking about all the things I'd done over the years to try to make Marcus's life easier. The late nights I spent sewing patches on his jeans so he wouldn't feel embarrassed at school. The time I drove 3 hours to pick him up from college when his car broke down, even though I had to be at work the next morning at 6. I'd convinced myself those things meant he'd always be there for me when I needed help. But sitting there with the folder on my lap, I realized none of it had guaranteed anything. When I walked into the office, the realtor, a woman named Karen, stood to shake my hand. She looked at me kindly, but I didn't want her pity. I just wanted this over with. She walked me through the paperwork to list the house, explaining the likely timeline and what I could expect from buyers. I listened carefully, making sure I understood every word because I didn't want any more surprises. She asked if I wanted to stage the house to make it look more appealing, but I told her it needed to be sold as is. I wasn't going to spend another dollar or minute trying to make life easier for Marcus at my own expense. By the time we finished, my signature felt shaky, but it was done. Karen promised she'd get a photographer out to take pictures for the listing within the week, and she gave me a folder of copies to take home. On the way out, I paused by the door because I felt this sudden wave of grief, like I was burying something I'd spent my whole life trying to build. But I kept walking because there was nothing left to salvage. When I got home, I set the folder on the kitchen table and sat down in the same chair where I'd first realized I was going to have to fight for my own life. My phone buzzed again, And this time it was Sarah. I let it go to voicemail because I couldn't bear to hear her tell me how heartless I was. Not when I was already so tired I could barely keep my eyes open. A few minutes later, the voicemail icon popped up, and I played it on speaker. Her voice was cold and flat. She said they'd spoken to a lawyer, and that if I thought this was going to be easy, I was wrong. That they were going to fight me every step of the way and make sure everyone knew what kind of mother would throw her own son and grandchildren out on the street. I listened all the way to the end, and when the message clicked off, I sat there in the quiet, feeling like I'd finally become the villain in Marcus's story. But no matter how much it hurt, I knew I wasn't going to stop. I couldn't. When you've spent your whole life sacrificing for other people, you start to believe that's the only value you have. But sitting there in my kitchen with my heart pounding unevenly, I finally understood that it wasn't selfish to want to live. It wasn't cruel to demand what was mine. I knew the next few weeks were going to be worse before they got better. That Marcus would probably show up to scream at me in person, that Sarah would keep calling, that maybe even Eli and Zoe would be told things that weren't true. But I also knew that every day I waited, every day I let their guilt and threats push me back into silence, was a day closer to not waking up again. So I picked up the phone, called Miss Cameron, and asked her to email me the next steps so I could be ready. When we hung up, I felt something inside me settle. Not peace exactly, but determination. I was done being the mother who always forgave, who always gave in. I was Joanne Mercer, and I was going to save my own life if it was the last thing I did. The following week felt like it stretched on forever, every day bringing some new sign that Marcus and Sarah were digging in their heels to make this as hard on me as possible. And by the time the realtor called to say the photographer had scheduled the house pictures, I was already so worn down I wasn't sure how much more I could take. But I told her to go ahead, because there wasn't any turning back. That morning, I sat at the kitchen table with the list of documents Miss Cameron had emailed me, making sure I had everything I needed in case Marcus tried to claim I wasn't the rightful owner. My hands shook a little as I checked each folder, and I kept remembering the way his voice had sounded when he threatened to keep the kids from me. How casual it had been, like he was talking about returning a sweater I'd borrowed instead of erasing me from their lives. By noon, I got a notification that the certified mail notice had been delivered, and not even 20 minutes later, my phone lit up with Marcus's number. I didn't answer, because I knew if I heard his voice, I might say something I couldn't take back. And instead, I let it ring until it went to voicemail. He didn't leave a message this time, but Sarah did. Her voice so tight it almost cracked when she said they wouldn't be moving, and that if I thought any judge would side with an old woman trying to throw her family onto the street, I was delusional. I deleted the voicemail without listening to the rest, and for a minute I just sat there, holding the phone, trying to breathe through the ache in my chest. I knew I should have called Miss Cameron right away to tell her about the threats, but I was too tired to talk to anyone, so I put the phone on the counter and poured myself a glass of water, standing there staring at the sink while I tried to remember a time when Marcus's voice didn't make my stomach twist. That night, I couldn't sleep, so I sat up at the kitchen table with the folder in front of me, reading over the deed and the tax receipts again, like maybe if I saw them enough times, I'd believe I really had the right to do this. Around midnight, I made a decision I hadn't planned on. I would go over to the house myself, not to fight with Marcus, but to look for the original will I knew had the last page proving everything. I'd looked everywhere I thought it could be, but there was one place I hadn't checked, the old file cabinet in the garage, where I used to keep important papers before Marcus moved in. I got dressed slowly, putting on my thick sweater and my walking shoes, and I took a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. My hands were clammy as I picked up my purse and keys, but I told myself I was just going to look, not to confront anyone. The bus ride over felt endless, and the entire time I tried to picture how I'd feel if I knocked on that door and Eli or Zoe answered. I didn't want them to see me like this, so I decided I'd go around the side and check the garage first. When I got there, the house was dark except for the upstairs bedroom, where I knew Marcus and Sarah slept, and I felt this dull ache behind my ribs when I thought about how many nights I'd stood in that same driveway carrying groceries or gifts for the kids. I walked slowly around the side gate, which was still unlocked, and I slipped into the garage as quietly as I could. The file cabinet was against the far wall, and when I pulled the drawer open, it stuck like it always had, making a scraping noise that sounded impossibly loud. I froze, waiting to see if anyone stirred inside, but the house stayed quiet. I flipped through the folders, each one labeled in my handwriting: insurance policies, old tax returns, maintenance records. And finally, near the back, I found a thick envelope with my name on it in black marker. My heart jumped so hard I had to sit down on the folding chair nearby. I pulled the envelope open, and inside were several documents, including the copy of the will I'd been searching for. I flipped to the last page and felt this huge rush of relief when I saw the signature and the notary seal, proof that the house was legally mine and that Marcus had no claim to stop the sale. My hands were still shaking as I tucked it back into the envelope and slipped it into my purse, and I was about to stand up when I heard a small voice behind me say, "Gran." I turned so fast I nearly dropped the flashlight. Eli stood in the doorway, wearing pajamas with dinosaurs on them, his hair sticking up in all directions. He looked so much like Marcus had at that age, it made my throat close. I tried to smile, to pretend this wasn't as desperate as it was, but my voice cracked when I said, "Hey, honey, I was just looking for some old papers." He didn't move, just stood there, blinking at me. And then he asked, "Are you mad at Daddy?" I swallowed hard because I didn't know how to explain something like this to a 14-year-old without sounding like a monster. I told him I wasn't mad, just hurt, and that sometimes grown-ups had to do hard things to take care of themselves. He shifted from one foot to the other, like he wasn't sure if he should go get Marcus. And then he said in a voice so soft I almost didn't hear it, "Daddy said you don't love us anymore." That nearly broke me. I put a hand over my mouth so I wouldn't start sobbing, and after a moment I managed to tell him that wasn't true, that I loved him and Zoe more than anything, but that love didn't mean I could let myself die just to keep things easy for everyone else. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with those big eyes, and then he turned and went back inside before I could decide if I should follow him. My knees felt weak as I stood up and closed the file cabinet. I slipped out the side door and pulled it shut behind me, and as I walked back down the driveway, I told myself I'd done the right thing, even if it didn't feel like it. On the bus ride home, I clutched the envelope to my chest, like it was the only proof I wasn't completely alone. When I got back to my apartment, I set it on the table and called Ms. Cameron to tell her I'd found the last page of the will. She sounded relieved and told me it would make everything easier if Marcus tried to contest the sale, and she promised to draft a statement verifying the document's authenticity. I thanked her, and when I hung up, I finally let myself cry. Not because I regretted what I'd done, but because it hurt so much that it had to be this way. I thought about Eli standing there in the garage, asking if I was mad, and I wished I could make him understand that I would have given anything not to be in this position. But as I sat there wiping my face, I knew that no matter what Marcus said or how many threats Sarah made, I couldn't change the fact that I was running out of time. I had to keep moving forward, even if it meant breaking the last pieces of my family in the process. I picked up the folder one more time and looked at the signature on that last page. My husband's name scrawled in that familiar way that used to make me feel safe, and I whispered to the empty kitchen that I was sorry it had come to this. But sorry didn't change anything. I was going to survive, and if Marcus wanted to make me the villain, that was a burden I was willing to carry. The morning after I found the last page of the will, I sat at my kitchen table staring at my phone, because I knew I had to call Ms. Cameron and tell her everything that happened at the house, including the part where Eli found me in the garage. But I kept hesitating, because some part of me still believed that if I just waited long enough, Marcus might call and say he was sorry, or that he finally understood why I had no choice. But by noon, it was clear no apology was coming. So I dialed the number and told Miss Cameron in a flat voice that I had retrieved the document and that Marcus and Sarah would almost certainly accuse me of trespassing. But I didn't care because the truth was the truth. And she said she'd draft an affidavit explaining the timeline in case we needed it, and she told me not to engage with them directly if they showed up at my apartment, which almost made me laugh because I knew Marcus well enough to be sure he wouldn't just stay home and sulk. He'd want to come confront me in person to try to bully me into backing down. And I was right, because that afternoon, just after I finished microwaving some leftover soup, there was a hard knock on my door. and when I looked through the peephole, I saw Marcus standing there, with his jaw clenched and his arms folded, like he was about to deliver some final ultimatum, and for a split second, I considered pretending I wasn't home. But then I thought about how many times I'd swallowed my pride to keep the peace, and how it had only ever made me smaller. So I opened the door and looked him in the eye without saying a word, and he didn't even bother with a greeting. He just said, "You broke into my house." And I told him calmly that it wasn't his house, that it was mine, and that I'd had every right to retrieve my own documents. And he shook his head like he couldn't believe how unreasonable I was. And he said, "You know what you're doing to us? You're going to destroy everything." And I told him I was trying to keep myself alive, that I would never have had to take any of these steps if he had just been willing to help, even a little. But he didn't want to hear that. He just kept repeating that I was selfish, that I was tearing our family apart, and I finally interrupted him and asked if he'd rather have me dead, because that was the only alternative. And he didn't answer. He just stared at the floor like a sulking teenager. And when he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, which almost made me falter, because I hadn't seen him cry since his father died. But then he said, "I can't believe you'd rather evict your own grandchildren than wait." And I told him I didn't have the luxury of waiting, that my heart wasn't going to hold out while he figured out how to feel like a good son. And he went quiet again, and in that silence I realized there was nothing left to say that would change his mind. So I told him I was sorry he felt that way, but the sale was moving forward, and I stepped back and closed the door before he could say another word. And as soon as the lock clicked, I pressed my hand to my chest because my heart was racing so fast it scared me. But I took slow breaths until it settled. And then I went to the table and picked up the folder with the will, clutching it like it was the only thing tethering me to sanity. That night, I got a call from Miss Cameron, saying the realtor had received an offer on the house, a serious buyer who was willing to pay enough to cover the surgery and give me a modest cushion afterward. And I should have felt relieved, but all I could think about was Eli's voice asking if I was mad, and I wondered if he'd ever understand that I wasn't doing this to hurt them. I was doing it because I didn't have any other choice. Mrs. Cameron said she would move forward with the paperwork, and that once the offer was accepted, the clock would start on the official eviction notice, and she reminded me again not to talk to Marcus or Sarah directly. But I knew it wouldn't be that simple, because Marcus had never been the kind of man to sit quietly and let something happen to him. I was proven right 2 days later when Sarah showed up at my door without warning, her eyes red like she'd been crying for hours. And she didn't even wait for me to invite her in. She just stepped past me into the kitchen and said, "You're gonna ruin us." And I stood there holding the edge of the counter because I didn't trust my legs to keep steady. And I asked her calmly if she'd like to sit down. But she ignored me and started pacing like a trapped animal, saying that Marcus had already missed 2 days of work because he was so stressed and that Eli was having nightmares. And I felt something inside me twist, because I never wanted any of this for them. But it was like she couldn't see me as anything but the enemy. And when I tried to explain that I'd spent my entire life sacrificing for Marcus, she stopped and turned on me with this look that made me feel like I was 12 years old again. And she said, "You think you're the only one who's ever struggled? We're drowning in debt. We took out loans in your name to keep up with the bills, and if you sell the house, everything falls apart." And it took me a few seconds to process what she'd just said, because for a moment I thought I must have misunderstood. But then I realized she meant it literally, that they had used my credit without my consent. And the room felt like it tilted under me. I asked her slowly if she was saying they'd forged my signature, and she didn't deny it. She just started crying harder, and she said, "We thought you'd never find out, that we'd pay it off before it mattered." And I sat down because my legs finally gave out. And I stared at her while my mind raced through every bill, every notice I hadn't understood, and it all clicked into place. All the little overdraft fees, the calls from creditors I thought were mistakes. I felt this cold clarity settle over me, like my heart was finally done making excuses for them, and I told her she needed to leave before I called the police. She looked like she wanted to argue, but I just kept staring at her until she turned and walked out, and when the door closed behind her, I let myself sink forward onto the table and sob, because it felt like everything I'd believed about my family had turned out to be a lie. When I finally pulled myself together, I called Miss Cameron and told her everything Sarah had admitted. And she went quiet for a long time before she said we had grounds for a criminal complaint if I wanted to pursue it. But all I could think about was Eli and Zoe, how it would destroy them if their parents were arrested. And I told her I didn't want to go that far yet, that I just needed to make sure the sale went through so I could pay for my surgery and get away from all of this. She said she understood and that she would document the conversation in case I changed my mind later. And when we hung up, I felt completely wrung out, like there was nothing left in me to grieve. The next day, Mr. Ortiz, my old neighbor who'd lived across the street for 40 years, called after hearing what was happening. And he offered to make a statement about the house and how I'd paid every cent of the mortgage and taxes, and even though I hadn't spoken to him much since I moved out, the kindness in his voice almost made me cry again, because it reminded me that not everyone saw me as a villain. He said he'd known Marcus since he was a boy, and that he never understood why I kept letting him take advantage of me. And I didn't have an answer, because the truth was, I'd spent so long trying to be a good mother, I didn't know how to be anything else. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen, holding the phone, and thinking about all the little choices that had led here. How every time I'd said yes, when I should have said no, I'd taught Marcus it was acceptable to treat me like this. And for the first time, I let myself wonder what my life might have been if I'd put my own needs first even once. That night, I lay in bed and tried to imagine what it would feel like to wake up after the surgery, to have a future again instead of just counting the days I had left. And I promised myself that no matter how ugly it got, I wasn't going to back down. This was my life, and I was finally going to fight for it. The morning the house sale finalized, I sat in the same kitchen chair where I had made every hard decision over the past weeks, my hands folded over the table while I waited for the call from Ms. Cameron to confirm the wire transfer had gone through. And even though I'd spent so many nights picturing this moment, I still felt hollow when it finally arrived. Like there was no version of this where I could walk away unscarred. My phone rang right on schedule, and when I picked up, Miss Cameron's voice was calm as she told me the buyer's funds had cleared, that the check for the full amount had been issued to my account, and that I was officially no longer the owner of the house I'd poured half my life into. I thanked her, and I could hear in her voice that she knew this wasn't a happy ending, just a necessary one. When I hung up, I sat there for a long time staring at the wall because all the anger and sadness had drained out of me, and all that was left was this quiet acceptance that nothing would ever be the same again. I stood up slowly and walked to the counter where I'd kept the hospital bill propped up against the sugar jar, like a reminder of why I had to see this through, and I picked it up with hands that didn't shake for the first time in months, because at least now I knew I'd done everything I could to survive. I called the hospital billing office, and when the woman answered, I told her I was ready to pay in full. And there was this long pause before she said, "That's wonderful news, Ms. Mercer," in a voice that almost sounded relieved. And it struck me how rare it must be for people in her job to hear that someone's found a way to come up with the money. As she processed the payment, she asked if I had a family member who could come with me on the day of the surgery for support. And for a moment, I almost lied and said yes, because it hurt too much to admit the truth. But I told her plainly that it would just be me, and that I'd arranged for a volunteer from the patient services department to be there when I was discharged. She didn't comment, just confirmed the date and time of the procedure, and when I hung up, I felt this strange mix of pride and grief, knowing that every last cent from that house was now committed to keeping my heart beating. I didn't give myself time to dwell on it because I knew if I started thinking about Marcus and the kids, I'd fall apart. So I spent the rest of the afternoon putting away the folders of paperwork I no longer needed and making a list of things I'd have to bring to the hospital. Around dinner time, there was a knock on my door, and when I looked through the peephole, my heart did that same tired lurch it always did when I saw Marcus standing there. But this time he wasn't alone. Sarah was with him, her eyes red, and behind them, Eli stood, clutching a paper bag like he wasn't sure if he should be there at all. I almost didn't open the door because I didn't trust myself to stay calm, but something in me knew I had to face them one last time before I went in for surgery. So I turned the deadbolt and stepped back. Marcus didn't speak right away, just looked around my small kitchen like he'd never been inside it before. And then he said, in a voice so low I almost didn't catch it, "It's done, isn't it?" And I nodded because there was no point pretending otherwise. He swallowed hard and glanced at Sarah, who looked down at her hands. And then he said, "We came to say we're sorry." And I didn't know what to feel because I'd waited so long to hear those words, and now that they were here, they felt too late to fix anything, but I still listened as he went on. He said he knew he'd failed me, that he'd let his pride get in the way of helping the woman who had given him everything. And he kept talking about how he'd convinced himself I'd always be there to pick up the pieces. That it never occurred to him that I'd finally have to pick myself over him. I didn't interrupt, just let him get it out, and when he finally stopped, the kitchen went quiet except for Eli shifting nervously by the door. Sarah stepped forward then and said she was sorry too, that she'd known about the debt and the forged forms and hadn't tried to stop it because she'd been scared of losing everything. And she started crying in a way that made me feel like I was watching someone else's family break instead of my own. I looked at Eli, who was trying not to meet my eyes, and I told him he hadn't done anything wrong, that none of this was his fault, and he finally looked up and said, "Dad said you hate us." And I had to close my eyes for a second to steady myself because it felt like a knife in my chest. I told him that wasn't true, that I loved him and Zoe more than anything, but love didn't mean letting people hurt you over and over, and he nodded like he was trying to understand, even if he couldn't. Marcus asked if there was any way to undo what I'd done, if he could take out a loan or find some other solution so I could get the house back, and I told him as gently as I could that it was too late, that the money was already with the hospital and the surgery was scheduled. And he rubbed his hands over his face like he couldn't stand to hear it. I knew then that this was the last time we'd all be in a room together like this, that no matter what happened with my recovery, we'd never come back from what we'd done to each other. But even as that thought broke something in me, it also set me free, because I finally understood I'd been carrying all of us on my back for decades, and I wasn't strong enough anymore to keep doing it. I told Marcus I hoped someday he could forgive me, that maybe one day he'd understand. I didn't do this to punish him, but to save myself, and he nodded without looking up. Sarah took Eli's hand, and they stepped out into the hall, and Marcus hesitated like he wanted to say more, but in the end he just said, "I hope you're okay, Mom," and he closed the door behind him. When their footsteps faded, I let myself sink into the chair and breathe, because there was nothing left to fight about. The next morning, I packed a small overnight bag with my robe, my insurance papers, and a picture of me holding Marcus when he was a baby, because no matter how angry I was, I didn't want to forget that once we'd loved each other without all this bitterness. The hospital lobby was quiet when I checked in, and when they called my name, I felt a surge of fear so strong I had to grip the counter to steady myself. But then I remembered how far I'd come. How many nights I'd sat in that kitchen determined not to give up, and I knew I could do this. As they wheeled me into the operating room, I closed my eyes and told myself that no matter how this turned out, I'd finally chosen to put myself first, and that was something no one could ever take away from me. When I woke up after the surgery, everything was blurry, but the first thing I felt was this quiet relief that my heart was still beating, that I'd bought myself more time, and even though Marcus and Sarah didn't come to visit, a volunteer sat with me and held my hand until the nurse came to check my vitals. When they discharged me, I took a taxi to the small condo I'd rented with the last of the sale money, and as I stood in the doorway with my suitcase, I felt something like peace, because it was mine and no one could ever make me feel like I didn't deserve to live in it. That night, I sat on the couch and looked at the picture of me and Marcus, and I whispered to the empty room that I still loved him. But I loved myself, too, and for the first time in my life, that was enough.